Transmission on a very important event that is taking place in Pakistan, the OIC Foreign Ministers Conference that is happening on Sunday. Pakistan is of course hosting this conference with regards to the situation in Afghanistan and the humanitarian economic collapse that is going on in the country. And of course what we want is for the different countries that are going to be gathering on the 19th of December to actually come up with real and tangible solutions to what's going on in Afghanistan and for real change to take place. That of course is the hope. Whatever happens remains to be seen. Faisal, before we went to the headlines, you were completing a thought. Why don't you do that?
Yeah, Farrukh was talking about, obviously about
No, actually
Taliban.
you were talking about something and I was just interjecting. Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
No,
Finish your thoughts.
Farrukh talked about the Taliban, that they are the, obviously, it would be really hard because they are not changing the stance. And of course, we are expecting...
No, actually, don't attribute Hamid's point of view on me.
Yeah.
I just said that they are on ground.
They are on ground.
So they are in control.
And there are demands from them as well. But I tell you one thing. I think we have very different Talibans this time. Why I say this? Because in recent days, what they've been saying, they have been, they have been asking for US, asking for the Western powers to come and talk with them. This is what they want to do right now. They want to give dialogue a chance. We never had such type of Taliban in past, and they have been claiming.
Sorry to cut you. How old were you when the Taliban were in government in '99?
Farrukh, I don't think we want to go
here. I was 15, 16 when they were in the...
But you were conscious of it.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not actually disputing this aspect at all. In fact, day before yesterday, Zalmay Khalilzad, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad gave an interview to Voice of America. And that was quite an illuminating interview because he said that these Taliban forces are ready to moderate their stance.
Exactly.
And because there was engagement in 12 at least districts, they have opened up schools for girls as well. And of course, I keep bringing up the edict that they came up with banning underage marriages, right? Yeah. So that was also very good. So engaging them is important. Yeah. But the question, and I was glad that both our guests in the previous segment were straight shooters. They actually told you what their countries or their institutions are thinking, right? And that's very helpful because Saudi Arabia is this larger than life, very influential factor in OIC and elsewhere as well. IDB is theirs, right? Headed by their people. So at this moment, it is important not only to tell them what should be done, but to hear as well.
Yeah.
And my concern at this moment is that the Taliban should be on a listening mission.
Yeah,
I
just wanted to add. My original question actually stemmed from the fact that why is there so much emphasis on whatever the Taliban can do? And I agree, of course, that's an important prerequisite of how things go forward. But is the same kind of emphasis being given, particularly with this conference, to the international community?
Right, and that's a very intriguing. That's a very intriguing question. Look, we asked Fahim also this question, right? And he actually brought up a very interesting aspect. Who is going to, because you are going to introduce some kind of mercy mission and take care of the people. So what are the channels or methods to ensure that? Whether you can do it without the help of the government in Kabul, or whether you can do it independently. Now the problem is because Taliban were really decentralized, foot soldiers actually command a lot of authority. So Kabul, whatever Kabul says, if it is not going to be passed to the foot soldiers and the districts, then perhaps those NGOs, those IGOs will have a difficulty in taking care of the people as well.
So the first step needs to come from the Taliban.
Yeah, exactly.
From Taliban. But I just wanted to highlight another fact about the very Taliban. Last year we had a tweet. I went through a tweet of Zalmay Khalilzad. In that tweet, he said that, we are fighting against ISIS Khorasan with the help of and with the alliance of Taliban in Nangarhar and Kunar province. This is what was happening while they were, negotiating peace and everything. If they can talk to Taliban at that time, and if they can call them an ally against terrorists like ISIS Khorasan at that time, Why can't they say it right now?
But they are engaging with the Taliban though, right?
No, but let us not actually confuse the two things. One is operational or tactical, alliance or collusion, right? The other is strategic. I understand what you're saying, but the fact is that most of the Western countries are democracies, right? And in their democracies, the news that kept on going for 20 years was who is the main enemy? It is the Taliban. And now there's a government in Taliban. Their people keep on saying that it was a failure, while we shouldn't be actually helping them in forming that worldview, because there was some negotiation and there was Doha agreement. So I don't see any harm in actually helping the West also to form a kind of opinion where they see Taliban as a potential ally.
Exactly.
Well, that of course is an extremely important step in the way forward, and we'll discuss more about this with our respected guests also. We have been joined by the senior analyst Jahangir Khattab. We'll see that if they're going to be part of the show. And we've also been joined by political analyst Professor Scott Lucas, who is professor at the Birmingham University, UK. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us on the debate. We, of course, are discussing the very important OIC Foreign Ministers Conference and the more important result in terms of whatever's going on in Afghanistan and whether or not it is going to have an impact in terms of changing the lives of the Afghans there. Before I move on to anything else, my first question to our guest today has been regarding the expected outcome, the most hopeful outcome that you can expect from the OIC Foreign Ministers Conference. At best, what do you think this conference can achieve? Why don't you go ahead, Professor Scott?
Well, I think you'll get a statement which will say this is a critical issue. We're concerned about the 38 million Afghans, including 23 million, who are at risk of food deprivation. So, I think we already know what the statement will be on Sunday. What you've just been discussing in studio is what we call when the rubber hits the road. And that is what happens with the aid. First of all, do you have a significant commitment to an ongoing delivery of aid? Now, we know, for example, that Pakistan has provided, for example, about $28 million worth of aid so far. We know that the Saudis, we don't know whether it's just for show or the start of a new commitment, have just delivered their first 2 plane loads of aid after the Gulf Summit in Riyadh this week. Other countries, I expect, will pledge aid as well. But it's not just a question of pledging aid. What your guests have also raised is one of 2 matters. And that is that the aid has to be, at some level, be coordinated with the Taliban. That is the government in power in Afghanistan. The Taliban has been allowing aid organizations to operate, but you still have to coordinate logistics. You still have to get the aid there. You have to be able to do it whether by air or by road. The second is that this aid needs to be coordinated amongst countries, not just individual countries provided aid, but between countries and with the United Nations and NGOs. Because if everybody just puts in aid, says, oh, we put in some aid, and there's no coordination, you don't have an organized way to hit the country to make sure that all areas where you have got risk of starvation are being covered.
Right, and that of course is extremely important, and perhaps the kind of real conversation that needs to be happening at the moment. What a lot of the platforms that have been discussing so far with regards to Afghanistan have been on a level which of course requires further groundwork, and maybe nobody's really paying attention to that. Mr. Jahangir, do you think that the OIC Foreign Ministers Conference is equipped to be having these discussions that are actually required in terms of any sort of step that comes out of it to be taken to benefit the people? For example, if there are pledges made, then is there going to be a discussion on the distribution and coordination on how it's going to happen, whether or not it's going to be given to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan? Are we going to have these difficult conversations?
Thanks for having me on the show. I feel that these discussions should be expected. We should be surprised if these don't. I think the bigger question is, because the world is very visibly divided in options. The West is looking at more like democracy and human rights and those kinds of issues. And Afghans are looking at 4 major issues. Those are hunger, like a collapsing economy, recognition, and terrorism. These are the four big challenges that common Afghans, not Taliban government, these are the challenges for, not except for recognition, these are the challenges for common Afghans. Just like Scott mentioned that there's a huge disparity in aid delivery. There is a huge, I think the world is even late, I believe, because many of the areas have already started receiving snow, and the temperatures are sub-zero. Logistical challenges will be there. They will increase by the day. And I think the world had pledged, if you remember, not very long ago, billions of dollars. Where is that aid? We don't see that. More than $1 billion were pledged by the European Union, if I can recollect correctly. The United Nations had organized a summit for raising money for Afghanistan in September. That was also more than $1 billion. So where is that money? I feel that the world is very slow not to talk about OIC, because I feel that OIC has always been a reactive platform rather than proactive platform. They come up only when the conditions suit them. I feel that this meeting will discuss it. I feel that the aid that has gone to Kabul from Saudi Arabia, I wish it had gone earlier. And I wish that it's a long-term commitment rather than one-time delivery, because Afghanistan needs a lot. 8 million Afghans are facing starvation. Just like mentioned before me, 23 million Afghans are short on food. 98% of Afghan population are not sure about their food security. And in a country which is facing the worst drought in 36 years, which has seen crops failing, its food production last year was 20% down. This year, it is going to be around the same. And it has a growing population. The malnutrition among the children, the numbers are staggering. So I don't know, like, if we should still have the time for discussion. I think it's time for action. I think that all these countries, even if they spend $1 billion and send a plane load, it will make a lot of difference in Afghans' lives rather than just talking.
Yeah. Professor Scott, I had a question. Looking at the history, if we look back, British, they always had an interest, obviously, in the region, and of course, in Afghanistan as well. We saw British during, post 9/11, they were actively, they were very active in Afghanistan at that time. But why now we are not seeing British anywhere? And what kind of help British can provide to the Afghanistan right now, looking at the humanitarian crisis right now? And Britain obviously has a history, a very good history, in which they have always helped the other countries.
Well, for what it's worth, last week, before the G7 summit in Liverpool, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss announced an increase in UK aid to Afghanistan by £75 million. That's about, I think, $100 million. Now, if you take that with a grain of salt, it was just for PR, it still remains the fact that the European Union remains the largest single donor to the aid for Afghanistan, if you consider EU aid plus that of individual members such as Germany and France. And then the UK also has made significant pledges. Just as Jahangir has mentioned, not all of those pledges are fulfilled, and that is an issue. But there has been provision of aid since the Taliban took over through some of the donations which have been made. The UN, for example, reached an increasing number of Afghans in September. It reached 7 million Afghans with food aid. It reached about 1 million with medical aid. Now, that is not sufficient, not when we're talking about 23 million who are food insecure. But the aid programs are there. They just need to be ramped up. And again, I think rather than taking basically a shot in an individual country, with respect, rather than you say Britain, rather than you say EU, US, Saudi Arabia, for example, you actually come back to this issue. Everybody needs to be working on the humanitarian issue. And I think that's happening. and let me put it to Jahangir and to yourselves, I think you're seeing less of the statements from the United States and from others about this idea of democracy first and rights first. They are concerned about rights, they're concerned about democracy, but they do go humanitarian first in their statements. And on the other side, I'm really struck by the statements from Pakistan, which after the Taliban took over in August, there was discussion, will the Taliban be recognized? Will there be formal diplomatic links? That now has been put, at least it's been pushed back a bit, it seems to be, with which is, look, the humanitarian issue, November, December, January through this winter, all the focus needs to be on that rather than these wider political and diplomatic
Absolutely.
issues.
You're absolutely right, Professor Scott. But of course, the important question is that even though the humanitarian issue should be at the forefront, is it really at the forefront of all the countries that are involved and our stakeholders in whatever's going on in Afghanistan? Mr. Jahangir, if we look at the fact when we say that there needs to be a coordinated approach or that everybody needs to be on the same page with regards to the humanitarian crisis that's going on and needs to take action accordingly, is this something that is a priority for everyone who's involved? All the countries, are they looking at it in the same way as we are?
I think, yes, there is a growing realization, because remember that if the situation gets worsened in Afghanistan, three things will happen. One, we will see mass exodus or people leaving, like huge refugee influx into Pakistan and Iran. And that will not stop there. It will go to Turkey and to Europe. Right now, there are 30,000 Afghan refugees in European jails. That's how they treat refugees in general. And Turkey has started building a wall on the border with Iran. And similarly, Greece has started building a wall on its border with Turkey because they want to stop influx of refugees. Now, the world has choices. Second is terrorism, and third is drugs. Because remember that opium is a very tough plant. It does not need too much care and water. So the Afghan farmers may go back to producing opium. And we could see a spike in drugs production all over it will go all over the world. So these are the big threats. Now, the world has choice. And I know you mentioned that are the countries interested? Yes, they are interested. The countries are interested, and this event happening in Islamabad, while I will be very careful about its outcome, I'm really looking at its importance from different angles. I feel that it's not just OIC
and that was really gratifying that you actually brought up those issues, Khatak Sahab. And I was glad that you mentioned topography, how weather is changing and how it is affecting people. And then you actually brought up a very interesting paradox regarding aid delivery as well. On one side, we know that Taliban need coordination. They have to coordinate with all the aid agencies so that it can pass it to the people. And then the world doesn't seem ready at this moment to recognize Taliban regime as well. And in the end, the problem lies with the fact that even if the world community actually pledges and brings the money in, Taliban, until they are recognized, they might not be able to coordinate in that fashion. So it becomes a paradox. How do you actually resolve that paradox? And on the other side, do we have any number figure regarding how much money might be needed immediately in Afghanistan?
Afghanistan needs $700 million by the end of January. This is what United Nations is saying. They are asking the world to please release the money that they have already pledged. They need $700 million to deliver basic necessities, and that too by the end of January. Secondly, I feel that in terms of delivery and action, remember that you have to look at your perception first. Like, what mindset are you bringing to the table? Right now, I see two scenarios. One, a world which is very kind-hearted, which is giving, which wants to help Afghans, and which is extending some help as well. And then I also see another world, which is looking at a dying man and giving a lecture on democracy and human rights. So I think that the world has to change its focus a bit more and focus more on the humanitarian side, because democracy and human rights certainly are extremely important questions. and issues and must be pressed everywhere. I think this meeting, not just the OIC meeting, I feel that the meeting of P5, the Troika Plus, that's also going to happen in Islamabad, where Pakistan, China, Russia, US, and then P5 countries, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Australia would also be there. I think that these are important gatherings. I think that majority of the countries which made big pledges, Germany among them, Germany pledged $500 million, not just for Afghanistan, but also for the countries bordering Afghanistan. Reason, the thinking in Germany, and rightly so, is that if we don't help the countries on the borders with Afghanistan, these countries cannot cope with any surge in refugee influx. So you have to help them as well. So I think they are doing that, but they have to be faster. I think we don't have too much time. And I feel that Taliban also have to show more acceptance when it comes to very legitimate demands from the world. And also, they should work more closely with the world. They have to really come up with some solutions. Like they have to make some decisions where their priority should not just be consolidating their government. Rather, their priority should be to help the Afghans who are in terrible shape.
And that's a very
Afghan
good point, Sana, with your
down.
permission.
It's horrible.
I have to ask Professor Lucas a question as well. Professor, regarding the international community's ability to help Afghanistan, we know that there have been IGOs and NGOs in Afghanistan. Do you think at this moment they have the kind of critical infrastructure to dispense with all the aid that might be received, sir?
I think there's the NGO infrastructure. I mean, because remember that the large majority of assistance that went to Afghanistan under the governments before the Taliban, including during the Ghani government, they didn't go through Kabul. They went through the NGOs itself. So the infrastructure's there. But let me raise a wider issue, which is along the lines of you give a person a fish, he eats for a day, you teach him how to fish, then he eats for a lifetime. And that is the question of a functioning economy. You know, you're talking about $9.5 billion, which continue to be held up by the United States. You talk about loans that have been held up by the International Monetary Fund. And from the point of view looking at the West, the question is, look, when are you going to release those funds to allow Afghanistan to function to rebuild an economy? But as Jahangir mentioned, that's a two-way issue because you need a functioning government in Afghanistan. Part of this is linked to social and political issues. I mean, the fact is, you've got more than 4 million Afghan children who are not going to school, that 60% of them are girls, that many girls cannot get secondary education because they have to be taught by women, and those women are not there at this point, that independent associations have either been shut down or they're scared to operate. I can give you the long list of political and social issues, but there's also a fundamental here, and that is, the Afghanistan has got to be able to run a national government, so they've got to get a Ministry of Finance, a Ministry of Economy. They've got to get a banking sector, which is seen as being effective. So there's a pragmatic issue here. There's a pragmatic issue about the international community allowing Afghanistan's funds to go back to Afghanistan, but there's a pragmatic issue about a government beyond rights, which I'm concerned about, but beyond rights, a government which can be effective in administering and delivering that economy that all Afghans need in the long term.
Right. So Mr. Jahangir, does this mean that the issues of inclusivity, the issues of recognizing the Taliban regime in Afghanistan are major hindrances in actually stepping forward in terms of humanitarian aid? Or do you think that an alternative mechanism can be arranged or a different solution without looking at these issues, because these seem to be taking a lot of time and we are facing with an urgent matter at the moment, a humanitarian crisis that's going on right now, can be dealt with? Which one is it? Are these real hindrances or not?
These are. The world is grappling with them and the world doesn't know how to react. But the world is learning to come up with some mechanism. You see, salaries were delivered or paid to sections of the Afghanistan's health delivery system but through the NGOs. Just like Scott mentioned, that one solution that has come up is that the money should be channeled through the NGOs, and Taliban should be asked to, and they are being asked, and I think they are also offering them full cooperation, or some cooperation or full, but I feel it is full, to deliver that aid. But I think that solution for the time being probably could work. For example, Taliban are saying that, just like Scott mentioned, that 4 million Afghan children are out of school. Another 9 million could stop going to school in the coming months if salaries are not paid to the teachers. So the international community can use the same channel that it used to deliver some money to the Afghanistan's health delivery system, to the education sector as well. So this way it can be at least sustained. But there's a big but. You see, for running an economy, you need a functioning government. And for a functioning government, you need not just clerics. You need technocrats. You need experts. You need people who have the background to run successfully financial institutions. That's what you need when you are running a functioning, effective government. And that's what is lacking as well in Afghanistan. I can give you so many examples where I feel bad choices have been made. And we are seeing the results as well, especially in terms of economy. Your economy is tanking.
Farrukh, do you think that this means then that all the pledges that we were earlier at the start of our transmission were discussing about, does this mean that all of that is redundant, like the previous pledges, if we're not really talking about the kind of mechanism that needs to be there or the kind of issues that need to be resolved before the money actually helps people? What's the point of the pledges?
Right. I think while I was listening to our honorable guests, actually one more thing actually occurred to me. And regarding your question, I think that with all these NGOs in place, and they have been there, and they are very courageous people, whether they are Muslim, whether they are foreigners, they have been working with the people of Afghanistan, and that's why you have UN and all these bodies that have been doing incredible work in the past as well. So I have no doubt that these monies will start reaching them and will be channeled through them. But while listening to other guests, I was reminded of a few cases where countries that were trading certain goods and services were actually sanctioned, and therefore they could not actually get money. For example, Iran, right? Iran was selling its oil to various countries like India. And at that time, what they did was they submitted money into escrow accounts. Through escrow accounts, you get guarantees, and then you get money from lenders or elsewhere. So I was really wondering at this moment, perhaps in coming days, all these reserves that the US has, if they could be treated as escrow account, or they could be shifted into an escrow account, then perhaps it won't directly come to the Afghan Taliban, but against that guarantee, they'll have some kind of financial pledges directly to help them pay salaries and all that.
But again, is this a possibility that is under discussion or will be at this conference, Faisal?
It will be, I guess, because I think obviously it is point of concern right now. They have to have an administration, and the administration right now, of course, it is being headed by Taliban, and they need to run the country, and they need money to run the country. And when they need money to run the country, of course, they will be looking at these kind of options as well. And that is the only why, we have been seeing the leadership, the top leadership of Taliban, they have been, coming on media and calling for $9.5 billion they have stuck in the Western world. They want it back. They want the money to be, shifted to the government of Taliban, so that they can deal with these kind of issues right now. Because otherwise, it would not only be, administrative crisis in Afghanistan, but of course, it would be a humanitarian crisis. With your permission, I wanted to ask another question from Professor Scott. First of all, I wanted to, hail the decor, the Christmas decor he has in the backdrop. It looks beautiful, and in advance I wanted to say Merry Christmas to him. And wish him the white Christmas this year. And my question to him is, as we know, the Europe and of course UK as well, they have concerns over refugee crisis. UK has been very generous in past. They have accommodated many refugees, especially from Syria as well as Afghanistan as well in the past. But now the situation is very dire in Afghanistan. It is to some extent, to the extent that earlier we in the program we did mention a story from Anadolu today, in which it highlighted that from $270 to $450 they are being paid whoever is joining ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan. As the people of Afghanistan right now are desperate because of the humanitarian crisis, we might see so many people, they will be forced to join ISIS Khorasan, and ISIS Khorasan is considered as a breeding space for Daesh, and we should not be forgetting that Daesh is is a threat to the Western world as well. I just wanted to ask Professor that wouldn't it be considered by the Western powers that as the humanitarian crisis is there, as the people of Afghanistan are desperate, they might turn towards something they should not be going towards? Wouldn't they be considering these facts and coming forward, and as they consider Taliban to be the lesser evil, if not the full evil, then they might sit with them and negotiate something?
Well, I think, as Jahangir mentioned earlier, I think they already recognize the connection between an ongoing humanitarian crisis and a resort to extremism. I don't think it's a question that people are forced to join ISIS Khorasan. People will willingly join ISIS Khorasan if they see that they are the way to provide short-term subsistence. Just as many people joined the Taliban in previous years because they didn't have an economic alternative. So I think governments recognize that. And again, I think what you're not hearing from the United States, the Biden administration, is the language of August and September, which is war on terror, over the horizon warfare, et cetera, et cetera. It's the guys you don't hear from. It's the actual bureaucrats and the agencies who realize we've got a practical problem on their hands. But let me add a couple of other complications for you. And again, one Jahangir mentioned, and I'll add a second. One is the refugees, and that is, look, unfortunately, and I'm speaking to you from the United Kingdom, with one of the most repressive governments in history regarding migrants and refugees, the doors are closed here. One reason why Germany, which took in so many refugees from Syria in 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, one reason why they're giving aid to countries around Afghanistan is they don't want refugees. They will not take them in this time. And even quoting from Anadolu, I smile just a bit because Turkey, which has 3.6 million Syrian refugees, they're not going to take any Afghans. So you've got a problem here is there's no safety valve, as it were, for people who want to get out. Secondly, it's the Iran issue in a different way. Now, Iran has 25% of the Afghans who have left the country recently. A large number of Afghans went there. So there's a humanitarian issue as well. But you cannot address that issue, let's say, fully and frankly, because of the ongoing US, Iran, and Europe nuclear talks. So the nuclear talks are squeezing out Afghanistan, at least on the Iran front, and to an extent, all the anti-immigrant, anti-migrant, anti-refugee rhetoric is causing further pressure on a sensible approach to Afghanistan, both inside and outside the country.
Right. Yes, Farrukh, you have a question?
Khatak sahab, and I'm just borrowing what was said earlier, and I'm just bringing it to you. There are two aspects which are very interesting. One, earlier you were saying that you see two kinds of responses. One, people or countries which are very humane and who want to help out. And then you said that there are nations or this approach who want to lecture a dying man. Then there came the third element, and that is the fear of refugees. You also brought up the matter of these walls which are being put up, and then of course there's the question or matter of fortress Europe, the way everyone actually wants to close their borders or their doors. So does it not actually converge all interests to help out Afghanistan before it explodes, and these refugees actually throng their borders and create some kind of political crises for these governments?
Excellent question.
That's very, very true. You see, Scott just mentioned Germany. Germany is the country which has the largest Afghan refugee population in Europe. That's why you will see Germany more proactive, because these Afghans have family connections and it's easy for them to find refuge if they reach there. And that's why Germany is doing all that it can. And it is doing that through aid and through diplomacy. I think one thing that we are missing here is, you see, if you want to stop refugees, you have to address a couple of things. And I think for that, you don't need the money that is, frozen in the US and elsewhere. Rather, you need some policy adjustments in the countries which are bordering Afghanistan. For example, I'll give you the example of Iran, because Iran just came up during the conversation. The bilateral trade between Iran and Afghanistan. Iran sold to Afghans products worth $1 billion. Iran accepted products from Afghanistan worth $17 million last year. So if Iran wants to help Afghans, while the aid is needed, food is needed, and it should be delivered, because when the Taliban came, Iran stopped oil supplies to Afghanistan, but later on it resumed. I wish they increased the trade volume, even though the Afghan economy is tanked. Industry is almost closed. Electricity, remember, there's a huge electricity crisis is coming, because Afghanistan receives most of its electricity from neighboring countries. And they are not paying the bill for the past several months. It did not happen during Taliban government. Rather, it was happening before that. So they can just turn off the switch, which means whatever industry you have, it may also close down. So Afghanistan may have very few choices when it comes to international trade or regional trade. But whatever it has, one thing that these countries can do, that especially the countries on the border with Afghanistan, is to open their borders for Afghan products. Let them come in. Even if there are sanctions, if you want to save lives and you want to go to the United Nations and discuss it, because the world is discussing. Remember, politics aside, I think that the humanitarian aspect is extremely important. We are hearing it from all the important quarters of the world, that the world needs to act, and it is acting, but as I mentioned earlier, it is acting in a very limited way. It needs to go beyond that. In
Absolutely,
Britain,
Mr. Jahangir.
Charity organizations are starting to raise money on their own for Afghanistan. This is what needs to happen.
And that is, of course, absolutely true. And we all understand that the humanitarian issues need to be a priority. But unfortunately, there are so many other dire situations that exist in the world today as well. And they are being largely ignored, and not enough is being done about them as well, which, of course, points to the fact that perhaps the situation in Afghanistan can also possibly go ignored. We have been discussing the OIC Foreign Ministers Conference for about 2 hours now, and we're almost nearing the end of the show. So I want to be able to still understand at the end what it is that really needs to be done as a first step. There's so many things that are interconnected or depend on another action that is to be taken. So what is the first thing that needs to be done for this entire cycle to take place, for things to actually have an impact? If things are dependent on each other, then what is the first thing we are looking at? Professor Scott.
Well, I think, let me put this in a wider context, and that is, while Afghanistan is understandably the most critical issue that will be addressed at the OIC, we have got other significant issues which have come up that are transnational, as it were, such as the coronavirus pandemic, such as the question which is going on regarding climate change, such as the widespread question of migrants and refugees. And rather than the OIC being a place where an individual nation stands up and tries to point score, and I'm not saying this would happen, but rather than, say, Pakistan saying we're going to present our interest, or the Saudis presenting our interest, or Iran presenting its interest, what you would like to see is a coordinated approach which addresses those wider transnational issues that are very much either 21st century creations or they are accelerating. Because too often what happens with the OIC, and I speak of this coming from the West and the UK, is it becomes an us versus them issue in the sense that, oh, if the UK notices or the US notices, it's like those Muslims are meeting over there discussing Muslim issues. And I'm not trying to say that to be disrespectful, but what you have is this artificial division. And the fact of the matter is the OIC is discussing issues that do not only concern Muslims, they concern everybody. And I think the more that it comes out from the OIC, this recognition of the global and transnational issues and emphasizing a cooperative approach, that opens a door. Because I think you will find a reception from other blocs and other groups that are not trying to divide up into the world between the US and China, Russia versus Europe, Hindu versus Muslim, but are actually recognizing we've got to get beyond politics, we've got to get beyond religion, we've got to find the common goal for all of us.
Right. I'll pose a similar question to you, Mr. Jahangir. Of course, the international community has its own demands, and then, of course, a lot of actions are also expected for them. And same goes for the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. For things to move forward, which of the two needs to take the first step?
First thing, decide that all the countries, especially the OIC members, and then, just like I mentioned, that this gathering is not just OIC foreign ministers. We will see extended Troika also meeting in Islamabad. So I think all of them should decide that we are on the same page and with a very limited agenda, don't broaden it, and it should have humanitarian side at the top, and then reiterate or deliver the pledges that have already been made, and the OIC countries should also add their pledges, because so far, if you look at it, the money that has been raised, I would say more than 90% has come from Western countries. The Muslim countries have given very little money, except for Qatar, which has been pretty proactive. Rest of and Pakistan, of course, a bit of Iran. Uzbekistan has been pretty active. Turkey has been active as well. But other than that, other rich Muslim countries have been on the sidelines. It's time for them to come pledge, make big pledges which they mean, and deliver it right away, and come up with a mechanism that works not just for the OIC members for delivery of that aid, but also for the international community, rest of the international community. Work with the non-profits, work with the infrastructure that is already being used to deliver aid, because time is critical and human lives are in danger. And I think that's what matters the most. That's what these foreign ministers or all those officials who are meeting in Islamabad should be looking at or aiming at, and come up with some money, open their purses, because Afghans need help. They are desperate. We are sitting in cozy, environments. The people living in tents, minus 10 degrees, are the people who need help. And we need to think of them and just start working for that.
That's very true, sir. With your permission, Sana, let me ask Professor Lucas a question. Professor, earlier when Taliban were in government, I'm talking about until 2002, at that time we had a disputed governance structure. There was a de facto government, there was a de jure government, and Western countries actually recognized Northern Alliance or their government. At that time, they still had some space to be represented on ground. At this moment, because Ashraf Ghani's government actually collapsed and he just went away, at this moment, it seems that Afghanistan's de jure government is there, a de facto government is there, but there is no de jure government. Ergo, there is no representation at the UN, other bodies either. Can there be any kind of assessment of what Taliban are doing without creating some kind of avenues for that kind of diplomatic presence on ground by the Western countries?
True. Well, again, it's a two-way process. I think what you're talking about is the path to recognition, the path to treating the Taliban not just simply as the de facto authority, but de jure. But again, you've got to take the other side of this. It's been made clear to the Taliban, not just by Western countries, not just by the US, but by countries in the region, including Pakistan, you need to have an inclusive government. And that's not just inclusive in terms of having different political factions in there. As Jahangir mentioned, it means inclusive in terms of having the skills, of having the people who have the ability to deliver the essentials. And so far, I have to say with respect, from what I've seen of the Taliban, the biggest issue has been the internal split within the Taliban between the Baradar faction and the Haqqani faction. And until you get the Taliban's house in order, I don't think they're even considering, where they broaden or even attempt to broaden the government. So, this has got to be beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis. As we go forward into next year, you've got to see movement on both sides. And again, and I hate to be, this isn't like casting blame, but I think practically the first step has got to come from the Taliban to show that they are a functioning government in reality as well as in name. And then, as so much happens politically and diplomatically, it happens behind closed doors, it happens away from the headlines. Then you'll establish the working relationships where the Taliban may be on a path not just to recognition, but probably more importantly from them, actually being a national government delivering the economic and social goods that are needed.
Right. Thank you very much, Scott Lucas and Mr. Jahangir Khadak, for being with us on the show. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. Before we conclude the show, Faisal, something that Scott was just talking about, of course, with regards to, and we've discussed earlier as well, of the Taliban taking the first step. The first step itself, maybe perhaps from the Taliban regime, requires a lot of work and a lot of time. And in our previous shows, we've also discussed at length that the progress made by the Taliban regime may perhaps also need to be taken into account. Is that something that you think can push things forward? Or are we actually still waiting for a first step to be taken by the Taliban, which may come perhaps much, much later before the urgency of the humanitarian crisis that we see right now?
I think Taliban themselves need to consider the current situation as well, as the whole world is requiring them to go towards the inclusive government. They can do. There are different aspects of an inclusive government, and we have been trying to figure out how inclusive it should be. But,
or what that means.
And what that means. And if they want the inclusiveness of the different sects and different races of Afghanistan, it can be done. And by the way, if we talk about the Taliban, it is, I mean, in a larger context, it is considered as, they are Pashtuns, but this is not the fact. There are Uzbeks as well within Taliban. There are Tajiks as well within Taliban, Hazara Taliban as well. So I think Taliban themselves are inclusive enough. But when it comes to the Afghan government, what kind of inclusiveness the world is looking for? This is the question. And I think if it is just about the inclusiveness of the women, it can be dealt with by the Afghanistan, the Taliban government,
right.
And they can do it, and they must do it.
Right, and Farrukh, we were earlier talking about how we need to have a more balanced or moderate expectation from this OIC extraordinary session. Right. Can we say the same for the expectations from the Taliban regime?
Right, and that's a very interesting point. On one side, of course, a country that actually collapsed, its own structure, entire infrastructure collapsed. It might not be, too, sane to actually expect the moon and the sun from them from get-go. But here's one very simple thing, and you have to understand this is the gold standard of everything. Before Taliban took over, there was a negotiation process that was going on. Remember, Professor Lucas said something very interesting, and he said that Afghan Taliban will have to prove that they are functioning government, right? Yeah. And what was happening at the time of Doha Agreement? They made certain pledges, and there is a signed document there, right? And Zalmay Khalilzad is under the impression that half of it can still be implemented and needs to be implemented. So in order to actually prove yourself that you are a functioning government, you'll first have to actually start owning what you pledged.
Sure.
If you actually can deliver on that, that means inclusive government also, and some kind of progressive measures for the girls, women, minorities, right? If that can be delivered in some structured way that convinces the world, I think things can move forward. But until then, my concern is at the UN and other international bodies, there is going to be no representation from Afghanistan, but only an Afghanistan-shaped whole, and that is not good. It is a big country. It has population. It should be represented.
And of course, there are so many issues of concern. Most of them that we have discussed in the show today. We'll also be back tomorrow at 8 p.m. once again to talk about the OIC Foreign Ministers Conference and of course the situation in Afghanistan and what sort of measures can be taken with regards to things moving forward there. The situation may seem very complicated, but it is also simultaneously very simple as well. And that is of course what needs to be taken into account by the international community and the Taliban regime as well, because people's lives are at stake, and Pakistan of course puts that at the forefront, which is why this conference is being done. It may not be the first step, but it is a very important step in the way forward in Afghanistan, and we of course have high expectations. Let's see what happens. Stay tuned to PTV World and join us tomorrow at 8 p.m.